Now, in neuroscience, and now you're asking about this, a new wave of models is coming in these days, and it's big time. It's really important. And it goes under the name often of predictive coding. And all that means is that we have assumptions about the world. I think this drug is going to make me feel better. There's an assumption. Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. And you take it, and that doesn't actually make me feel that good. Oops. Well, so what we spend a lot of time doing is reshaping the assumptions to the input, to the data input. And there's always a stream of input, which the assumptions are pulling for. Yeah, well, this is a good thing when when Dave comes along, we play guitar. That's nice. That's great. Okay, Dave is here. Here we go. Prior, assumption, input, and they're in sync. But when they're not in sync, what happens is we do something called error correction, which means that we either need to reconceptualize the input. Well, this isn't really fun, or well, this guy doesn't like me after all. Or we modify the priors. We modify the core expectations. Where that plays out in IFS, I think is fascinating.
I'm joined here by Cece Sykes and Marc Lewis. But to get started, guys, could you just give a little bit of introduction to yourselves and the work that you do? And as an adjunct to that, just let us know what your thoughts on addiction are. What is addiction, or this thing that we call addiction? And we could start with Cece and then move to Marc.
Hi, Niall. Thanks for having us. This is kind of exciting and fun. I've been in clinical practice for a very long time, many decades, over 4 decades. So if anything, my superpower is being a therapist, and this is what I love. At some point, 25 or so years ago, I got into internal family systems as a type of therapy, and loved that. Although I had lots of skepticism in the beginning, which we can talk about another time or later today. But one of the pieces of this model is that it looks at behaviors as having positive intentions, adapting to circumstances, despite whatever negative consequences those behaviors are causing. So in my own family life, personal life, marital life, all these different places in my life and a bunch of generations out there in my Irish Catholic chaotic family, that it hits all the buttons for food, drugs, alcohol, suicide, sexual, misbehavior, all of it, abuse. It's all there. So this has meaning to me personally and professionally in my work. I've worked with survivors of trauma for my whole career also. So all of this comes together for me as a way to think about this. So how to think about this and how to help people, whether they're, your family member or your client, it all comes together as a way to conceptualize this. So this is something that's just front and center for me. And I have loved meeting Marc a few years ago and talking with him about it too.
Yeah, Cece was oscillated between being my therapist, my consultant, my friend, my conspirator, and collaborator, and then back to therapist. So yeah, it all came together.
Awesome. And then Marc, what about yourself? You've got an interesting background too. Could you just give us a brief overview of the journey you've been on?
Sure. I had a long-term, very serious struggle with addiction in my 20s, after 2 years in an oppressive boarding school, and finally quit my opioid addiction around the age of 30, got back into grad school after having been kicked out, got a PhD, became a professor at the U of T, University of Toronto, and and I'm still waking up, and then did that for about 25 years and gradually melded into the clinical practice. And now I've got just about a full-time clinical practice. I see, I use IFS therapy, which I have learned in all kinds of ways, much of it from Cece, with people, whoever walks in the door, people who are depressed, anxious, traumatized, relationship difficulties, but addiction probably covers about 40% of them. which, as I say, is just kind of an expression of difficulties, of emotional difficulties, a way of trying to deal with them, which kind of works, for a while, and then has all kinds of costs that we know very well, that we know about often the day after, or in terms of lifestyle and all the rest of it. But indeed, it's a it's a search for an adaptive, and it's a set of habits that make us feel better because we feel really shitty one way or another. And so in that respect, it's not specific to a certain population group phenomenon. It's a very general way that humans have to try to get by, try to get along.
So can we unpack that a little more? So addiction is, you're saying, it's almost a set of habits to help relieve suffering for people in very difficult situations.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of the people I see have, it's either cocaine or alcohol in where I am, in mostly people who are reasonably well educated and reasonably well employed, and many have families and are dealing with all kinds of real difficulties, which are inevitably made worse by their addiction. So, one guy, for example, I'm having a hard time with right now, really bad Coke addiction. Coke makes him feel stronger and more intact and more focused and more alive. And that's really good because a lot of that stuff was squished and confused in his growing up years. And it always goes back to the growing up years. It always goes back to family dissensions and usually pretty nasty family environments. And he's just really having a hard time stopping, even though he's an educated, smart person who has a job actually as high-level job. And it feels the attraction, the craving, the desire, that part of you, that part of us that now is activated. And this is an IFS concept that now comes to the surface. I want this, I need this. This is the only way I'm going to feel okay right now, is if I consume whatever it is. And then in a model that I learned from Cece and that Cece has written about in her book, An Internal Family Systems Approach to Addiction, it's the other player in that dynamic is the very harsh, judgy, critical part who says, I can't believe you're doing this again, you asshole, you idiot, you fool. And there's an ongoing polarization between these two parts that really dominates the internal space and becomes more and more entrenched and habitual as time goes by, making it more and more difficult to quit, because the judging part actually activates the need to escape, the need to get away, to be free.
That makes a lot of sense. Anything to add there, Cece?
Well, I just appreciate what Marc's saying, and this sense of softening the difference. First of all, the first thing you said is softening this distinction between clients with addiction and everybody else. I see sometimes, like in community mental health, the people that are merely suffering from trauma and anxiety can go in the front door, and all those addicts can go in the side door to their methadone clinic. There's something around this that we're continuing to look at it, with that stigma around that and the distinction. I understand, of course, there's differences, but this idea of softening this distinction, that anyone who uses any kind of substances or food practices is an addict, and everyone else is just, justifiably miserable. And there's some subtle little judgment around, they really gone off the deep end. Oh, haven't they? So this, I was, what the heck? Then by now, and listen, I know people personally. I've had clients. I have that feeling sometimes, like, oh, by now, can't you do something? Of course, the feeling of wanting someone to do different is also powerful. It's powerful. It's inevitable. I always say it's physics. If you're with somebody who's out of control, who's hurting themselves and others continuously, and you are close to them and love them or care about them or are their therapist, then the urge to want to stop that cycle to stop them in their tracks and help them is almost inevitable. It is way harder to stay curious, non-judgmental, and I don't mean, and just emotionally unattached to the outcome. Way harder to stay like that than to step in and go, okay, let's talk about this a little bit. Okay, let's get real. The urge to be more controlling. So to resist that urge is quite powerful. It takes some work on the part of the therapist and, of course, family. And if we want to go there, there's a lot of things to look at. The 12-step community and the 12-step practices have known this for the 80, 90 years that they've existed. Don't tell someone there's an alcoholic. You don't tell somebody. They tell themselves. What you do is take care of yourself, work around your own stuff, speak for your own feelings, and invite them and let them know that there's some new options, but let them figure it out their own way. Now, there's some places in there where I would step in somewhat differently, but the idea is that, of course, you want to do something around someone who's not doing something for themselves. But the last piece I want to say about this is, if we are going to manage other as a client or a loved one, then what I always say, here's my Zoom. What's going to happen is, if we're in their management and we're managing, their managers are going to go offline. The more I manage them, the more their managers are like, oh, all right, okay then. And they will respond with those parts that defend their practices. They defend, they're in denial. And what's really going on there is that they're reacting to someone who's in judgment and tells them to stop without any curiosity. And what those parts of them that are invested and committed to checking out or creating some sort of space or ease or pleasure, what those parts know is that there's pain underneath it. And so when you help someone who's helping them, which can be a therapist and can be a loved one, to get out of their managers and say, I'm okay, I'm just here. I'm open. I love you. I'm here. What are you going to do? How do you want to do this? When we can be in IFS terms around that, it allows the person to find their own parts to say they're concerned. As I say to clients sometimes, I get that your loved ones are yelling at you and they're always mad at you, and that's so uncomfortable, and they never see the good things you do, and I so get that. But I got a question for you. Do you have any part of you that also says, okay, the stakes are getting higher, I'm in trouble, I am spending too much money, time, etc.? Do you have a part of you? So this is, and they're going to say no? They say, of course I do. I wake up every morning hating myself. So now the client, the helpers, can get out of the manager position and help them find their own system and their own inner balance and find their agency. And this is really key when you're feeling dependent, is to find your own agency.
I just want to underline what you said there, Cece. I think it's so important that if you're coming into this sort of from a manager point of view and there's judgment there and you're trying to change the other person, you're going to activate these defensive parts of the other person that are protecting them for a reason, and you're going to get nowhere. So, but if you're coming from this place of curiosity and self, as in IFS speak, then a different dynamic's going to unfold, and that's...
There's a classic sort of, one's an addict lying whenever their mouth is moving, all those sort of judgments that exist. They're manipulating you. They're trying to get your money. They're trying to get your attention. There's so much stigma attached. And part of it is, of course, because the person who's using is in a constant state of suffering, is ruled by parts that feel desperate to stop the pain, and yet feels chronically misunderstood. Within themselves, they're confused. They don't remember why they're using, and by others.
For sure.
Really good reminders, yeah.
And just something else I'm curious to ask is, you've been doing this work for decades, Cece. Have you noticed any patterns or any changes in people that are coming to you struggling with addiction? Do you think it's more common? Are there any differences in what people are becoming addicted to? Do you think it's, are we living in a time in human history where this is particularly high? Any comments or observations there?
I'll talk about my own experience and some other things of other people I know out there who are talking about this. I think there's a few changes. One is that, and I don't want to spend a whole amount of time on this, but it cannot be understated that in the last 10 to 20 years, when we've all had a computer in our hands, that has changed things. You can now gamble with something in your hand. You can watch porn with something in your hand. You can shop with something in your hand. So in and of itself, and you can just get preoccupied. That level of preoccupation, our brains weren't quite ready are quite prepared for that high level of stimulation. So this does exist in the world. This is a part of it. This does lead to isolation. And I was just listening to some guys talking who were running a treatment program for young adults in California. They said back in the day, you used to have, Marc, you might relate slightly. They used to have to work with kids about being kind of wild out there and getting in trouble out there. And in addition, like the behavior issues, in addition to using. But for these kids, they're kind of like, I want them to get in trouble. They finish a meeting and then they go to their room and read their phone. So there's something around isolation that's really painful, and loneliness so that if you're on your phone, you're blocked from feeling the level of loneliness that you actually have. In IFS terms, those protectors that are keeping you on the phone are blocking you from feeling isolation or alone or not enough. So there's a real additional screen or shield. In addition to all the other things that Marc talked about, the pain that people are just experiencing that they've held a long time from what they experienced growing up and adolescence and young adulthood.
Marc, if you have any observations you'd like to share about, our cultural moment and the patterns of addiction we're seeing in society these days.
Yeah, I'd rather respond to some of the things that Cece said just at first, because this is a great refresher for me. So obviously when Cece talks about managers, we're talking about parts in the IFS lexicon. Managers are parts that protect us in a proactive way by trying to set a course and continue to modify and correct a course that will keep us safe deep down and socially, right here in the present and inside. So the really good reminder about if the therapist goes in too far and does too much managing, then in a way you're usurping the internal managers whose job it is to rectify things, to steer the ship, to rebalance the ship that's wobbling. And I probably have gotten too involved with my coke addict, this particular guy, because I care about him a lot, and his life is such a mess. So I go in there probably too proactively. So that's a good reminder. The other thing about, and related to your question, Niall, is phones. And the thing about addiction classically is that we get addicted to things that satisfy the concerns and needs quickly, immediately. And that speaks to a condition, that we call delayed discounting, that all mammals and some species of birds have a very interesting way of assessing the value of immediate rewards that makes them seem way more valuable than long-term rewards. So even if it's a bird, you can go after, the nuts or the worms that are right there in front of you because it seems more valuable than the much larger whatever food cache that's over there somewhere, because that would take some doing. And I make a joke, when I give talks, you never hear somebody say, let's do some coke next Tuesday. You just don't, right? It's the immediacy that is so compelling. So for humans, that delay discount, I just call it now appeal. And a lot of people these days are talking about dopamine circuitry, which is not about pleasure for the most part. In some ways it is, but it's also about wanting, desire, focus, aim, approach, behaviors. And that whole system gets tuned to what is available right away. And that has to be, I got to call my dealer now. I got to buy this thing now. I've got to watch some porn now. I got to do some coke today. With phones, as you say, reward is immediate, it's in your hand. And so that really plays into delay discounting in a kind of insidious way, because the rewards are immediate and kids get used to that. And why would you want to, that one over there, tonight, or getting my homework done, or feeling good about this or that? That's way off in the distance. That doesn't seem so special. But I could watch, this cool little image of a cat jumping through a hula hoop, whatever, right now. So that's an insidious. Besides the isolation, that's the way that internet technology has usurped some of our ways of balancing addictive tendencies. And as far as clientele, I don't know. I don't really scout for differences that are, normative differences, and except Coke seems to be a big one right now. My own kids, I got 19-year-old twins, twin boys, were here last night till all hours. In fact, some of them are still asleep. And they're wonderful kids, but they're really interested in drugs. I was, and luckily they're interested mostly in psychedelics. And I think psychedelics can be beneficial, can open up all kinds of doors of learning and accessing ways of knowing that are otherwise difficult to find. I'm glad they're not into cocaine. I warn them, I talk to them, I scold them, I say, don't, and if you do, don't, like that, because a really big difference between drugs that are intrinsically harmful and drugs that have some beneficial value to them. So, yeah. So I see a lot of their peers are also interested in drugs. There's a whole smorgasbord of new drugs, which designer drugs, or what they call research chemicals. They have names for them. Research chemicals. That's a category. Which I like some research chemicals. I've got some CB2CB and this and that. I mean, half of them I haven't heard of. 2/3 of them, most of them I haven't heard of. But they're new psychedelics, or psychedelic-like drugs. Ketamine is kind of a member of that category, a fringe member, and so is Molly, ecstasy, MDMA. So that's the wave I'm seeing in terms of drug use, which doesn't hopefully lead to addiction as much as it just leads to perhaps exploration and a flirtation, and hopefully they're going to also move on.
Interesting. So, Marc, I wanted to get your thoughts on this as well. You come from a developmental psychology and a neuroscience background, and you've been working with IFS now for a number of years. How can we understand IFS through the lens of neuroscience and developmental psychology? Do you have anything you'd like to share on this?
Well, that's exactly what I think about every day, all day long. Yeah, so that's what my book's about. And my book is about the voices in our heads, but the kind of starting place is that there's 4, 5, 6 contemporary psychotherapies that are all kind of would be included under the banner of parts psychology. So they all recognize the value of looking at the mind in terms of different parts, components, multiplicity. And it's not only IFS, it's schema therapy and voice dialogue and what else, and self-compassion therapy, and there's a few of them. I think IFS is the most popular, and it's a very effective one. I'm quite attached to it. But none of these approaches really have very much. They work sometimes quite well, but nobody really knows what's going on here. What are these parts? And clients will often ask you, well, what are these parts anyway? And there's no answer built in. So we don't know. Why does the mind do that? Why does the mind, diversify into epicenters or components or regions, each of which has its own kind of character, feelings, beliefs, ideas, wishes, goals, fears? Why does it do that? So using neuroscience and developmental psychology to try to ground current therapies, and especially part psychology, to figure out what's going on. And that's what I try to do. And of course, to me, it's a big and complicated and difficult topic. But first of all, we can't find parts in the brain. You just can't. And anyone who says they can is just bullshitting. The brain doesn't work that way, and it doesn't look that way. But we can find parts in the mind. And one of the most interesting aspects, I think, is that parts become manifest. They arise in the moment, in real time, and we can say, "Oh yeah, I know my critical part. I know that part. You know, it's horrible. I don't like him, her, it." But it wasn't around so much, an hour ago, and it's around now. And why is it around now? Well, maybe because I'm thinking about getting high. That would be one reason why that part is drawn in. So what does that mean? And then you can think about a relationship, and I think Cece would agree with me, I think, about this, that parts are aware of each other in the sense that when they become activated, they're part of a dialogue which goes around the internal family. The internal critic is very aligned with, in a negative way, the part that wants to use drugs or alcohol. Don't you do that. And that critical voice is always about that nowadays because it's been doing that for 5, 10, 20, 50 years, whatever. So that part now is has developed like a personality, like a person, like a part of a person, into a very specific set of thoughts, goals, beliefs, and triggers. And is related to another part that likes to get free, which is related to another part that feels very scared and alone and shamed, which is related to another part, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when parts arise, their activations are overlapping and shared in the mind and therefore in the brain, even though we can't measure it yet. So that's important. What does that tell us? I think part of what that tells us is that parts are not little people that are, fashioned or formed that we carry around with us. They're ongoing, emerging, developing entities that continue to consolidate in development over the years, but they also consolidate in real time, which is to say that this part has become very now specific on a Tuesday night when my friend comes over because he sometimes has cocaine or whatever. So junk in development, long term, and junk in real time, short term, because that part is now called on by what's going on in the circumstance out there in the world and in here in the family. So I think that's an important way to try to understand what's going on. Does that make sense?
It does. That's so interesting. It reminds me of something I read in Cece's book, actually, about, the most important thing whenever you're looking at addiction is to not even look like, I think you don't even like the word addiction, Cece. You call it an addictive process. And the most important thing is a sequence of events around the addictive behavior. Can you share your thoughts on this?
Right. Well, first, I love that Marc is going to apply that his science, his neuroscience mind to this. I'm waiting for the answer. Waiting on where the so what's happening, mind, brain, all of this is just completely fascinating, and I'm not at all equipped to look at that for a variety of reasons. One, because I'm just so pragmatic. I just like, this is how it's working in my, this is how it shows up. But I love what Marc is talking about, which is the systemic piece to it. I love the fact that these talking about parts as beings or entities, that they do develop and shift over time. We say that in therapy, that my critic has softened. My critic is not so harsh. The part that uses doesn't need to use anymore. My little exiles filled with shame. We've unburdened. We've released some of that shame. That's a perfect example that things evolve. So the idea that all of these processes are developmental, which is, I think, Marc's core, understanding of things is I agree with completely. Where I came in around, the idea that the inner world is a system did start with Dick's idea of calling this, Dick Schwartz, an internal family system. So, and because he was initially trained in systems thinking is for any entity which reacts to its parts in a pattern. And that's general systems theory. It's not IFS or even family systems. So family systems adopted it. Dick took it. But I think where I go in this moment, when I'm teaching and when I'm sitting with someone, but when I'm teaching, is this idea, the idea of why did this happen or what propels us? if I think sort of the universal need to function and stabilize, we have a label that for them called managers, but we all have to eat, have to have a place to live. We have tasks in order to survival tasks. And this is forever. So we have sets of behaviors that are survival tasks. In addition to survival, at some point, we develop some attitudes like shaming and control and rules for others to make things work towards ourselves and the ideas about what's good and bad, what helps and doesn't help. So this would all come under the manager idea because it's all trying to keep us and our culture and our community and our family surviving and working well. And at the same time, if that's all we did, what kind of life is that? So we also have this other set of parts to say managers are what we do. Firefighters are doing something else, anything else. So, yeah, to feel free and to feel joy. I say they're here to help us feel sweetness, joy, pleasure, sensuousness, and novelty. Change it up. That we have a desire for that in the human spirit. So that the human spirit has always had to function. The human spirit has to have rules and attitudes that help us survive and be coherent as individuals and in community. We also need, ecstasy, joy, expression, right? Pleasure, sweetness, something besides. So also in human experience, not that I'm an expert on all of it, but since, for centuries and centuries and centuries, we've seen little gambling dice. We've known the presence of beer. All of these things have existed. We've had ceremony with fires and chanting and dancing and singing and putting things in the fire and letting them go to the spirits. This has been a part of human experience forever. How we slipped, danced, and stumbled our way to civilization drunk. Right, it's a part, it's a part of the human experience and ceremonial, and it's embedded in very early experience. And last but not least, in IFS, we say there's also something vulnerable in us, something which I call our shared humanity. They were labeled exiles because they end up getting repressed if they're filled with pain. But if they're not filled with pain, it's that sense of innocence, of sensitivity, of open-heartedness. So a baby, I'm a grandma now, I get to be around new babies and old babies. And anyway, again, to be born into the world in a relatively safe environment, you are open-hearted, you are trusting of others, you are sensuous, your whole body ooms, you want to touch, you want to feel, you like pleasure, babies laugh before they talk. I was just reading this recently. They laugh before they talk. They have humor. They get things like, that's silly, Mom. You're putting it on your head. That doesn't belong there. They get this at 6-7 months. So these are our vulnerability that is shared. We all have the capacity also to be, because we're also open, that openness, we absorb what's in the field. So if what's in the field is painful, shameful, shaming, violent, hurtful, anxiety-provoking, we absorb some messages and some memories and some teachings or beliefs within ourselves about that as well. So these parts, their innocence and openness results in they're little sponge parts of us, and they hold a lot. So when that gets too weighed down, then our parts that are helping us survive, our manager tooth, are like, they're on steroids to get us perfect because there's all this pain in here. And then our firefighters like, perfect? Are you kidding? There's a lot of pain in that because we can't succeed. So they come in to help us have pleasure or relief or just rest, and stay away in a more extreme way. So these efforts are core.
We are the only species, I think, or close enough, that does planning. We think about the future. We always think about the future, whether it's 5 minutes from now, I'm going to get another coffee, whether it's this afternoon, I've got another appointment, blah, blah, blah. We're always doing that. So that's huge in terms of as you say, at first it's all present tense. And then the capacity to see into the future comes along and says, hey, I can fix this. I can improve this. I can make it so that mommy doesn't get mad at me, so that I don't get spanked, so I don't get sent to my room. I can make it better. And there we go. And then we've got little manager parts that start their huge, lifelong climb towards sophistication, articulation.
Well, and you're talking about it, it's great to think about, because of course we need to plan, like when am I going to have my food? Of course we needed to plan, that's been essential. But what you're saying is when we are adapting to an environment that's not emotionally safe or welcoming or accepting, then our planners use new skills. Now they plan to watch mom's face or dad's face, and they plan to adjust my actions. So you're really talking about the developmental piece, and then the context. What requires them to? How do they develop this way?
So yeah, a lot of that starts, I think, very big time around the age of 3 to 4, when kids acquire theory of mind, as it's called. Theory of mind is a fancy way of saying around the age of 4, kids get the cognitive software that allows them to be able to imagine that other people have thoughts and feelings and in perspectives, which means that dad can look at me and say, oh, he's not he's just a little kid. He can't do anything. Oh, shit. Well, that's not very good. Or, maybe I didn't wipe my bum well enough. Maybe mom's going to think that, I didn't do a good job. Oh, that's not very good. So this capacity for theory of mind, or, we also talk about it being connected to mirror neurons and other neural, ground anchor points, starts the ball rolling in terms of managers developing the capacity to organize according to what we think other people are going to think of us. And that preoccupies us like 95% of the time, because that's the world we live in, that social world of whizzing rewards and punishments, shames, compliments, esteem, disesteem, it's all happening. And then there's other parts like the firefighters. They're getting high parts that are like, this is too much. I can't do it. I can't make it feel okay. The firefighter metaphor comes from wanting to spray out the flames of anxiety, shame, shh, just bring it down. And kids don't really do that very much until, I don't know, just say maybe adolescence or pre-adolescence. It's like,
Yeah, they get better at it, but there's just little ways that they're learning. Even so, it depends upon the child. But some kids start. I might ask a woman, when did you first think there was something wrong with your body? When did you first go on a diet? 5 years old. Or when did you? But kids, might shoplift, steal candy to have friends. Even at 9 or 10 years old, lay. And think of a client who used to lay with the boys in the park. She was so hungry for touch and for comfort, and so I agree with you, though, Mark, that most of that happens around that early adolescence. We start finding some ways. We have more access to other ways to soothe. But little kids will sit in front of TVs and eat and watch TV, and who are alone and isolated. And that is a way people will go back to very early memories of trying to comfort themselves in certain ways.
well, yeah, I mean, thumb sucking is, pretty classic, right? Is that a firefighter? Like maybe it is kind of a built-in. One of the troubles with IFS, I mean, certainly not perfect, is that these categories blur. And a lot of what people do when they want to get high is they plan and think and, strategize. Well, is that a manager or is that a firefighter? Like, I mean, there's both. There's forward thinking and there's also, I want to feel better. And they're very interlinked. So the categories start to become less valid, less useful when we really think about the parts. Parts are very individual. They're very unique to the person. This is how I feel better when da 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 and da 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 and da 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 da. And in the addiction world, we talk about drug set and setting, as you implied before. All of those addictive behaviors are related to what's going on in the room, in the conversation, in the head. So there's that. Now in neuroscience, and now you're asking about this, a new wave of models is coming in these days, and it's big time. It's really important. And it goes under the name often of predictive coding. And all that means is that we have assumptions about the world. I think this drug is going to make me feel better. There's an assumption. Well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. And you take it, and that doesn't actually make me feel that good. Oops. Well, so what we spend a lot of time doing is reshaping the assumptions to the input, to the data input. And there's always a stream of input, which the assumptions are pulling for. Yeah, well, this is a good thing when when Dave comes along, we play guitar. That's nice. That's great. Okay, Dave is here. Here we go. Prior, assumption, input, and they're in sync. But when they're not in sync, what happens is we do something called error correction, which means that we either need to reconceptualize the input. Well, this isn't really fun, or well, this guy doesn't like me after all. Or we modify the priors, we modify the core expectations. Where that plays out in IFS, I think is fascinating. I'm going to be writing about that. But the idea, mostly what neuroscientists think is that we have a particular core assumption that is activated in this circumstance about that perception. What about if we have several different ones? A few different assumption places, priors, they call them priors because they're pre-organized. And if this one doesn't work because things are really shitty, and my girlfriend doesn't love me after all, then we'll switch over to that one. And that begins to sound like parts, a la IFS. So we can think of.
Yeah, patterns of behavior. So I guess what I hear when you say that is that sometimes I say we have to learn that we have different parts, that we have different motivations, if one part has a particular intention for us. Parts tend to have intentions. But once we understand that we have different parts, what I'm teaching people is it's not just the part, it's the pattern. And what I hear you saying is that there's a pattern of behavior. So when I help people find, I say, I want, find a part that, you like to help you soothe and get away from it. Now see how you feel toward it. Oh, I don't like that part. But how is it trying to help you? It's helping me feel better. How often does that happen for you? So there is patterns.
You're talking about that as a therapist, of course, and that's what you do. I'm talking about what the brain does. And it's not about thinking about, what am I going to do about this? Because the brain just does what it does. So if there's a mismatch between input and the activation of a prior, of an expectation, the brain will automatically start to adjust. Putting those two ideas together is exactly what's missing from psychotherapy, the absence of science, the absence of actual psychological science from our models of psychotherapy. And I think there's a lot that we can do about that.
Well, I'm going to leave that part of it to you, but I will say, but I'm not against it. But what I would say is how does the mind, what's your answer to this? Or maybe now you might have a question here, but how does the mind interact with the brain? So how does my concentration, my focus, my consciousness, my bringing extra awareness into my life, which is what I'm doing when I'm individually and what I'm helping someone do in therapy, which is increase their ability to have awareness, consciousness, identify what they're doing at different points in time, identifying their underlying intention, identifying their deepest underlying emotions. That's bringing an enormous amount of consciousness or awareness to their process. How does that consciousness interact with what the brain is doing?
So you're talking about the opposite direction. I'm talking about how the brain can rescue psychotherapy. You're talking about how psychotherapy can rescue the brain. And I think you're absolutely right. What we learn about consciousness and intention from these deep interpersonal interactions in the therapy hour helps us think about how much intentionality is involved in restructuring these entrenched neural processes. It's a big deal. I think that's a really cool two-way street and people are writing about that.
I would love to know, because what I assume, what I imagine, I'll say it this way, Marc, what I imagine is that when I bring compassion towards parts of myself that I have rejected, I'm imagining that I'm creating new pathways, new neural pathways that didn't previously exist. So, but this is stuff that is truthfully, That's just, I have no science background to speak to that exactly. So I would love more clarity around all that.
All good, but it's not that hard. And it's, we do talk about the brain often in, in more street language because we have to, because otherwise, well, we're not sitting here with an MRI machine. We have to find a balance between real life and what's going on in the synapses. But I really like the idea that you've brought in of how a thing like self-compassion, there's no understanding of that in neuroscience. We do know there's a little part called the insula, which does empathy, which lights up in people who've meditated for 20 or 30 years, like high-profile Buddhists, if there was such a thing. That their insula is actually bigger, and it also lights up when they look at photos of people in trouble, like victims of war or whatever. So what am I saying? That neuroscience needs a lot of help in understanding things like the role of compassion, intention, will, all that stuff. It really is a two-way street.
Mm-hmm.
This is slightly off topic, but something I'm curious to ask you both, and maybe starting with Marc here with the background in developmental psychology is the role of play, in the sense that, as children, we're always playing, and I think we're kind of built to do that, but as adults we never get that. And I'm just wondering, have you ever thought much about a connection between a lack of play in life and addiction? If there's anything there, and if you've ever thought about that?
It's a really good point. I don't think I've thought about it nearly enough. Play really is important. And a lot of people, when they get high, whether it's things like opioids or, sedative-like drugs, or, drugs that provide more stimulation, like psychostimulants, they feel more able to connect, to socialize, to have casual, fun conversations, which is an adult version of play. I feel more comfortable. I can go to a party. I can talk to my girlfriend. I feel more relaxed. So, and we know that when we give mice opioids, they actually play more. They really do. They when we give them opioids, they play more. They roll around. They tickle each other, literally, and they have sex more when they're high. So there you go. So maybe the absence of play in our lives is kind of an open invitation to let's fix this by moving, having fun, getting high, getting away from the normative, constrained way that we approach life.
I play 7-a-side football once a week, just soccer for you guys, and the past couple of weeks I've been injured and haven't been able to play, and my life has it's down a couple of notches just in terms of day-to-day well-being. So I'm really trying to get back from injury for this. And I was listening to a podcast recently about there's a new study out recently that one of the biggest protective factors against dementia is actually dancing. Like dancing is one of the best things you can do to prevent dementia later in life, apparently.
Yeah.
So off topic, but worth sharing.
I'll just say something about play, which is, if I know I can be almost obsessed with labels, but if we want to think of a healthy firefighter activity, firefighters are not just here to take us away. They are also here, again, to provide balance. So do we have enough time for that in daily life, or are we always on survival mode emotionally or task-wise, or exile mode, feeling just overwhelmed? Is that taking up a little too much space in the modern world, and has it for a long time? I would say yes. And if firefighters are here, whether it's walking your dog, playing with your dog, I'll ask people, what is your favorite firefighter? And they'll go, what do you mean? Or what is your favorite way to soothe or relax? I ask people all the time, what do you do to mark the end of your workday? How do you know when you stopped work and you started something else? I get blank stares. Or that's when they have wine, or that's what, So to include that in the work, which is what are some other things to help you soothe and relax and find pleasure. And, you know, whether it's taking photographs or playing the ukulele, playing soccer, you know, walking around the block, whatever shifts. I always think that how do we shift gears? And do we ever shift into the pleasure, sweetness, fun gear? And I think it's a really important thing to rebalance around that. I love the just as you say, Marc. I love Marc's honesty. Am I thinking about that enough? Maybe not.
And this is one of the problems with labels like addiction and even the IFS, categories of firefighters and managers. They stop working. I'm like, is Niall, are you an addict? Like, you say you need to play soccer every week. Are you an addict? Right. I mean,
Arguably so, yeah.
And people who dance regularly, are they addicts? Like the distinction stops making sense.
Or it makes the perfect sense. And we could say that very lightly. Yes, I am. You know what I mean? Without judgment, because do we love that? And to me, what that sits with, Marc, is this sense of what you're talking about, which is just we could not label it, but how can we look at it without judgment?
Oh yeah, that's a huge deal. And you're talking about the sociological, social aspects of the problem. Absolutely. It's enormous. The stigma problem is huge. Yeah. I kind of leave that to you guys sometimes, because that to me is overwhelming. Too hard to understand.
Okay, so stigma is just huge. It's one of the biggest barriers to people reaching out for treatment. And I think I always try to help therapists ask people, how do you soothe? How do you relax? How do you shift gears? Because if we don't ask, our clients are not likely to even tell us. They have shame around whatever they're doing with food or whatever they're doing, even if it doesn't rise to high risk behaviors. And then if it's high risk, they really added shame. So, and I love what Marc's doing, where we're really trying to sort of even the scales and open hearts and minds to just including these behaviors as part of life.
So I spend a lot of time, not a lot. I often have to remind my clients, I'm really not judging you. Yes, okay, I'm really not. And okay, so you never mind, you used cocaine last night. You used some this morning. Oh, wait a minute. Like just before you came to the office? Really? Like I'm supposed to, right? And actually, I don't feel that way. I really don't, because I remember being like that myself. That helps. And people really need to know that, feel that, trust that. And it's hard because the societal tide is so powerfully in the opposite direction.
It's so true. And again, if we don't tell a client who's been up all night with their anxiety, you should leave. You're way too anxious for this therapy to work today. But if someone was up all night using a substance, we would say, someone might think that they're supposed to tell them to go home because they're altered. Clients are altered all the time. So again, softening that.
For sure. So obviously a big part of IFS rests on this idea of this capital S self, this kind of, this deep, organic, wise part of ourselves that knows what's best for us. And in IFS, I might be getting this wrong, so if I do, please correct me, but would it be right in saying that the way that is typically accessed is by engaging in dialogue with these parts, helping them to relax, and then it's almost like the clouds kind of part and the sun or the self can kind of shine through and sort of guide the system. Something I've been wondering about recently is thinking in terms of actually maybe other ways to approach that, because I've noticed in my own life that whenever I exercise the qualities of self, then self emerges within me in terms of like, if I'm curious or if I'm compassionate, then this thing comes to the surface that's bigger and better than my ego. So I was just wondering your thoughts on accessing self, and has that been your experience as well, that there's sort of different ways you can approach bringing it out of people and bringing it out of yourselves?
It's a great question, and it really points to something that historically Dick Schwartz really struggled with. He had very specific ideas, and I'm not sure he holds them quite as specifically. I'll answer for myself. But historically in the model, we think of it as a constraint releasing model. And the purpose for that clinically is you welcome your client as they are, however stressed, however many parts, however protected they are. Start here when you help them, help their parts of their emotions step back, more self is released. So constraint releasing. And however, we do know, we can say, you know what, I am going to go take a walk around the block and we feel better. So are we choosing to find more self energy in that moment? Does it help? There's all kinds of stuff. We have sort of these 8 C's. I'm working with some people at an addiction treatment center called High Watch. Also with the medals, we're doing some work as well. They do things like have someone put pieces of paper on the floor with different qualities of self and then say, go stand next to this one. Which ones do you want more of? Which ones do you need now? Which ones do you need less of? And they go over there and somehow something shifts inside. Now, what is that? So is there choice, or can we bring it, or can we invite it in ourselves? So I might say, and I'm really, I might be getting neurological here. I'm really breaking it down a little bit, but to say, when I have the capacity to choose, I did say there should be a 9th C called choice. So if I can choose to walk outside, if I can choose to say, I'm going to focus on calm right now. If I can make that choice, there's already some self energy there in that choice, and I am expanding it. What I do, because I don't think of self as static. We can have some, we can have more. It shifts throughout the day, throughout the moments. And then ideally over a lifetime, I created a continuum years ago for teaching it. And so within a session, you might you might gain more self energy within one session. Over the course of therapy, you might gain more self energy. And over the course of a lifetime, if we are lucky and keep focusing and evolving, we have more self energy. So it's very fluid, but I do think we can make a lot of choices, but I do think we have to have a little bit of self in order to do so.
Okay, thanks, Cece. And Marc, any thoughts?
Lots. I think about that a lot too. It's so important, and clients have a very hard time. They might get a glimpse of it. They feel it. They feel the warmth. And how do I get that back? How can I bring it forward? So, Cece, you're talking about we have to have a little bit of self in order to arise at a place where we can have a sense of choice. Some of that. Yes, right. Then I've actually been thinking about that. This week, I finally came up with, every week I come up with a new model. I think, oh, now I've got it, right? So my model of the week is that it's like this. Um, so if your bicycle is a problem, it's squeaking or it's got, it doesn't shift gears well, whatever, then you get like an oil can. It's not a can anymore, it's a little tube. And you go and you look at the points. There's about 8 or 10 or 12 points where you could apply oil. The chain, the gear shift, the cables, the brake, whatever. So I think of these parts as manifesting in development and articulating in the moment. This is this and this is in between and almost. And my critical manager is getting pretty fierce, but it's like he's also feeling, geez, enough of this already. And so what you do is look for the places where you can apply oil. Look for the juncture, right? And each juncture is a choice point. So each juncture, can I bring some self-compassion here? No, that doesn't work right now. No, I'm too sick of that part. I don't like him anyway, so never mind. But over here, I could bring some self-compassion there because it's been a really hard week and you deserve a break. By God, come on. So give self-compassion. That's a place where I can get it in there. And you can do that at a few points, and then magically the system softens, right? The system relaxes.
I love that example, and I can see clients loving it. And I would just say that one little piece is the idea of just noticing. So I say to clients all the time, what do you notice? And even people who are neurodiverse and don't want to be asked how they feel and so forth, What do you notice? What little bit of activation? What little bit of quiet or calm? So that ability to invite, which I think we can invite over time, we can invite it in ourselves. And often we need help, interpersonal, right? We need that interpersonal to grow. We can be invited to notice. And what you described, Marc, is noticing who needs oil and where I feel like putting it, where I feel like going. And that's a lot of noticing. And that is if you notice it and then you name it, that's huge. So I think that sometimes the idea of self feels just too esoteric, too out there, too hard to grab a hold of. But the idea that we have one, I'll just say something and then I'll stop. The idea that we have one does separate IFS from some other models of parts. And I think what it helps therapists do is listen differently. It trains us to listen for moments of noticing and quiet without activation. It trains us to listen to that rather than we are not just listening for parts. We are also listening for moments of self. When my client says, my brother called me, he asked me for money. I didn't give it to him and I didn't get mad. I just said, no, I love you. No. I said let's pause there. That's what self-energy feels like. So it trains us to listen for those moments as well as to identify our activation. Does that make sense? And to notice the difference between activation and less activation. And I think that that's an important piece.
So, and just to be clear, Niall, I don't know what you're using this for, if anything, but if it's going to have a public function, it would be useful to, when we say self, we often call it capital S self. Like that's a very specific nomenclature, right? Capital S self. What do we mean by that? It's kind of confusing because it's pretty much what the Buddhists mean by non-self. What's nothing to do with that one, right? Because so the Buddhist idea of non-self is presence, acceptance. I'm just here. Cognitive structures come and go, but presence is like be here now, whatever. In IFS, the idea of self is a lot of that, but see, what I learned from you is that self has a slightly different flavor to it. Well, the way we use the idea, it's also about taking care. It's about caring for. The Buddhists also, right? I mean, this is a lot of what I learned from you. And the Buddhists, self-compassion is a very important idea in Buddhism as well. They say that you need self-compassion in order to have compassion for others. But there's a real active sense of, I want to be there for you. I want to take care of you. Very active for me, in the idea of being in self. Does that resonate for you?
Right. I don't want to fix you. And I know that's not what you mean. It's just something about that being open, that open-hearted acceptance.
No, I mean for oneself.
And I want to take care of you here.
Yeah, for non-capital self, to take care of me, to take care of Marc. To be in self means I'm going to be nice to myself. I'm not going to hurt myself. I'm not going to take drugs or do stuff that's going to make me feel bad. I'm not going to criticize myself unnecessarily. I'm going to, love myself and get myself, understand, oh, this is how I got here. All of that, it seems to be, to me, built into the IFS notion of capital S self.
But I think just having faith that exists, that there is this part of you that has agency and a genuine desire for your well-being is just transformative. If you take that seriously,
yeah,
you live in a different world.
Huge.
I think that's right.
And by the way, it's also what Tara Brach, who is a huge following, right? I'm sure you both know her, Tara Brach. Yeah, radical. She has me too. But her whole thing is about exactly that. Her RAIN algorithm, RAIN, recognize, allow, investigate, nurture. N stands for nurture. It's precisely what I think we mean by capital S self. Nurture.
Yeah. And as a therapist, to assume that my client has a self, even though they are so messed up, so crazy, so using, so sad, have had so much trauma, unspeakable trauma, but to assume that they have that capacity within them, guides everything I do and say.
Definitely. Well, I could talk to you guys for hours, like I really could. But we got to wrap up there. Thank you both so much for your time. Where can people find you both online? Your websites, your books. Where will we send people after this conversation? We'll Cece and then Marc.
You can go to my website, ccswsw.com, and find access to my newsletter, to my book, to other publications I've written. So that's probably the best place to start. And you can contact me from there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Cece.
So my website is a total mess right now. It's really just kind of broken down. I haven't had time to fix it, but it is still functional. So if you go to, if you look up my name, Marc Lewis, and Understanding Addiction, it should show up. The URL still is the title of my first book on addiction called Memoirs of an Addicted Brain. So that will also get you there. And I've got quite a number of talks, podcasts, interviews.
Yeah, you've got some good, beautiful YouTubes out there too, Marc.
Yeah, there's a lot. That's right. I do have a YouTube channel, I think. Pretty sure I do. Yeah, and it gets followers. So it's not hard to find me and my stuff, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well, we'll end there. Thank you both so much, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Niall.
If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy getting our 7 Insights newsletter. This is a once per month email where I share 7 of the most valuable insights I've uncovered in the previous 30 days. It includes book, podcast, and documentary recommendations, as well as questions and quotes specifically curated to help you live a more creative, intentional, and meaningful life. It currently goes out to over 50,000 subscribers each month. And if you're interested in joining them, you can sign up via the link in the description.